There's a big reason why McLaren wants an answer over potential cost cap consequences for Max Verstappen's engine change at the Brazilian Grand Prix ahead of F1's final triple header. It's actually not about stirring up potential trouble for arch-rival Red Bull. Instead, it's all about McLaren's own tactical planning for the title showdown ahead. This all kicked off on the Sunday morning of the Brazilian Grand Prix when Verstappen, the only external title rival to McLaren's Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, took a fresh engine that he will carry into the final races. Interlagos qualifying had been a disaster for Red Bull, with both cars out in Q1 for the first time since the 2006 Japanese Grand Prix. With nothing to lose, it elected to make major changes to Verstappen's car ahead of the race and broke parc fermé to do so, which meant a pit lane start. And that also negated the 10th-place grid penalty that would have otherwise been incurred for taking new engine components beyond the season's allocation. So as well as heavily revising Verstappen's setup, Red Bull took the opportunity to fit an entire fresh Honda power unit, taking an extra internal combustion engine, turbo, MGU-K and MGU-H beyond the 4 allowed for a campaign, plus a third battery and control electronics. The crux of the matter now is whether that's going to have a cost cap implication for Red Bull, because McLaren thinks it should, and if it doesn't, then McLaren's got some thinking to do. And as Las Vegas Grand Prix week began, McLaren still hadn't had clarity from the FIA on whether Red Bull was allowed to take that extra engine outside the cost cap or not. While teams are sometimes forced to make engine changes for genuine reliability reasons, there has been a trend in this latest rules era for performance factors to come into play too. As the life of power units has been stretched to cover more and more events, their performance has to be wound back to reduce the risks of reliability trouble from covering that extra mileage. An engine that only needs to last for 2 or 3 Grand Prix weekends can be run in far more aggressive modes than one that has to last for 5 or 6. Plus, engines' performance degrades over the course of their life as well, although how much this happens varies between the different manufacturers. Red Bull's Honda engine is understood to have become quite consistent. Team boss Laurent Mekies was clear though that there was a gain to be had. It's not known how much Verstappen's incredible recovery from that pit lane start to a podium in the Brazilian Grand Prix was down to the new engine, and how much was because of the major setup revamp done to his car, but it can't have hurt. Mekies explained that while the benefits of a new engine were probably not massive, the gaps in F1 were small enough for everything to be important. Mercedes was once known to have quite a steep drop-off with its engine. It readily admitted in late 2021 that its engine lost more power the longer it ran for and became a reliability concern. That prompted Lewis Hamilton's grid penalty that year in Brazil, with performance boost from that new engine helping set up a stirring fight back. The implication at the time was that Mercedes had suffered a reliability setback from chasing performance in response to 2 external factors that pushed it to dig deeper than it had expected to need to. The first was Ferrari's controversial engine progress in 2019, which fell in a Mercedes-enraging grey area that led to a settlement between Ferrari and the FIA going into 2020, when Ferrari's power unit performance became weaker, but only after Mercedes had to push its engine hard through 2019 to try to fight back. Then in 2021, Mercedes was in a title fight against Red Bull and Verstappen in what was supposed to be Honda's last year in F1 before withdrawing, and Honda went all in on improving that last official engine so it could bow out in style. Mercedes had to bring forward major engine developments that had been planned for the following season, and this impacted its durability. However, that was 4 years ago, and it was obvious at the time that Mercedes had identified degradation over power unit life as a priority to solve for the engine homologation in 2022, and that of course is the engine that's now powering McLaren. Since then, Mercedes has improved its work in this area, so there is not such a steep drop-off over the course of a power unit's life. McLaren team principal Andrea Stella feels fresh engines nowadays do not deliver as big an advantage as they did in the early years of the turbo hybrid rules, because manufacturers have got better at keeping performance at a high level. However, there is lap time available if a power unit can be run in more aggressive engine modes, because it only has to do a few races at the end of a season. And this is why potential gains from running a fresh engine are something McLaren is keeping an eye on in this final phase of the campaign, especially as any power boost Norris or Piastri could have on tap may become important for their title ambitions. But the final call on whether an engine swap takes place is not just about performance, because financial consequences in terms of cost cap limits weigh heavily on that decision too. The cost cap issue is why Red Bull's decision to go for a new engine for performance reasons has prompted intrigue at McLaren. From McLaren's perspective, if a team changes engines purely because of performance, then that has to come out of its cost cap allocation. If an engine change is in response to a failure or reliability worry, it doesn't. If Red Bull has managed to engineer a situation where it could gain from a new power unit but not face financial consequences, that's counter to what McLaren thinks should be allowed and how McLaren's been planning its own season. and it would open the door for McLaren to do the same thing and go for a swap if an opportunity came up where it made sense. It's highly unlikely to instantly drop in fresh engines for its drivers because that would still incur a 10-place grid penalty, and Verstappen remains too close for comfort to do that. But what if either Norris or Piastri has a qualifying disaster similar to Verstappen in Brazil, and there's the opportunity for a free engine change? McLaren's uncertainty is because the line between when engine changes do and do not fall within cost cap limits is not specifically covered in F1's financial regulations. Instead, it's an area where the FIA has issued guidance to teams, with an overall stance that there needs to be solid grounds for teams to change a power unit if it's not to be included in the cost cap. Some teams, including McLaren, believe this means only a genuine reliability cause counts, not a voluntary swap to get extra performance. The thinking behind having a different approach to engine changes for performance versus those for pure reliability is that a cost cap implication on top of the grid penalty is a further way to deter teams from repeatedly throwing fresh power units into a car to boost speed. But the reliability allowance means a team that needs an emergency power unit change in the final events doesn't suddenly trip over the cost cap limit through no fault of its own. How changes are ultimately determined as being for genuine reliability versus performance opportunities is a grey area though, and this is why Stiller spoke out and called what Red Bull did a challenge to F1's regulations. McLaren's stance is not about stirring things up for Red Bull as the title battle nears its conclusion. It's facing its own internal debate about how to handle things if Norris or Piastri needs a fresh engine, and that debate is complicated by how hard McLaren's trying to engineer absolute fairness across its battling drivers this season. Both drivers have used the maximum number of free components in their pools when it comes to the main items: the V6 engine, MGU-H turbocharger, MGU-K control electronics, and battery. While McLaren hopes it can make it through to the end of the campaign with its current allocation, it's not something that can be guaranteed with 3 race weekends remaining, one of which is a sprint event. A forced swap because of a failure would be unavoidable, but equally McLaren wants to know what strategy options it has to make a change on performance grounds too, if an opportunity like Verstappen's arises. It's clear from what Stella said in Brazil that McLaren does not want to make a change within the cost cap, because the extra expenditure could tip it over the spending limits for this season. After all, engine swaps do not come cheap. While the specific costs of a power unit are not known, the 2026 F1 regulations do offer some insight into the kind of figures being talked about. As part of the power unit financial regulations, next year's rules lay out a reliability allowance for the different components. This includes a $1 million allowance for the internal combustion engine, $150,000 for a turbocharger, $175,000 for an MGU-K, and then $215,000 each for the control electronics and the energy store. This effectively makes a full power unit for next year equivalent to $1.755 million in the cost cap, so this year's version with an MGU-H2 is probably close to $2 million. From McLaren's perspective, the engine considerations are much more complicated than Red Bull's because it's having to take into account both of its drivers in any call that it makes. Handing just one of its drivers a fresh power unit to boost performance could influence the fairness of the title battle between them, even when taking into account any grid drop penalty that may be required. Verstappen showed in Brazil that any hit for an engine swap can still be recovered from if your car's fast enough. So could McLaren feel it has to give both cars fresh engines to ensure fairness given its situation? If such a double hit had to be included within the cost cap, then a circa $4 million cost would almost certainly carry McLaren into tricky territory when it came to ensuring it has a buffer in its cost cap spending, and that is not something it wants to gamble with or do unnecessarily. A decision on committing to an engine swap on one or both cars would be a different matter if it was told there would be no cost cap implication. This is why the FIA's answer over the cost cap is important, because that will help McLaren lock in its battle plan ahead of the critical final 3 races of the season.